It's not every day you find yourself having a pint in the Liberty Bell with, of all people, the fourth Earl of Ivy, Arthur Edward Guinness. To the locals, and to me, he is simply Ned. And of course, the people in the Liberties remember a time long before Diageo when their paychecks said Arthur Guinness and Sons. And while an awful lot has changed, I suppose one thing that hasn't through Ned and his family is a familiarity between the locale and the name. In recent years, Ned has been in the press around the Ivy markets, a contribution to the area he's really proud of, but I think he's not happy about what became of it, nor am I or many others. And last year, he told the Irish Times of his hope to see the Ivy markets, to walk past that place and not see the weeds inside, the trees growing up on the rafters. There's great hope in his voice when he speaks about the markets, and there's finally reason there to be hopeful. Now, Ned is the author of a new history of the family, authored with Antonia Hart, a historian who has a really brilliant sense of Dublin's commercial history. And if you know her work, it's most likely from the extraordinary project around Dublin ghost signs, things we walk by every day that tell the story of our city commercially. And she's also the author of a study on women in Dublin's commercial history. And I think Ned, armed with a deep knowledge of the personalities, and by God, there are personalities at play in his family story, and Antonia, with her great sense of the pounds, shilling, and pence of Dublin's commercial history coming together, what they've produced is just really, really fascinating. More than a family biography, it's a book that positions Guinness and its commercial story against the backdrop of a city. And you know how in just a few generations did a Kildare brewery that became a Dublin brewery become a global brewery and a global name. House of Guinness is entertaining, and I will always defend those who bring history into that kind of medium on the basis that it isn't their job to tell us exactly how it was. And be it gang violence in interwar Birmingham or the shelling of the GPO, television and film directors, they might take the core subject from history, but narrative is what drives their stories. And it must be really odd to see your ancestors, people you know from the primary sources you've held in your hands, depicted by someone else, and speculation on their private lives and all kinds of details about them. So I didn't meet Ned to talk about that television show, and I think his book very much deserves to be examined on its own strong merits. The story of Guinness is a story of success. It's also a story of tension and clashes. You know, we go from the very beginning, a small-time brewer moving to Dublin, a name that in different circumstances could have remained in Kildare, to a brewery in an ever-changing Dublin. We also touch on politics quite a lot in this. I mean, at times Guinness were entangled in political questions, whether they wanted to be or not. In the Bureau of Military History, a Limerick Republican remembered the kickback against the brand over support for Ulster opposition to Home Rule. And this man told the Bureau of Military History it resulted in a boycott of their product, Guinness's Stout. For a time, only Murphy's was consumed locally, but after a while, the boycott eased. The company came through that time, the revolutionary period, and grew to have a more than positive relationship with the new state that came from it. So from the Liberties, here is a conversation. Guinness, A Family Succession is available now from all good bookshops. I should mention too, tomorrow is the day that the voting closes in the Irish Book Awards. The Dublin Pub Social and Cultural History is up for one. I'd be chuffed if you take a moment to give it a vote. New Island Books are an independent publisher, and it means a great deal to see it there. So thank you very much for your support for the Dublin Pub. Guinness began by the Liffey, yes, but not in the hustle and bustle of the Liberties. In Leixlip, a plaque from the Leixlip Heritage Circle reads that here Arthur Guinness and Richard Guinness leased a brewery in 1756. The name Richard Guinness is comparatively unknown now, but he, father of Arthur, was vital to this story. Leixlip, with fields full of grain and a river to power its mills, was its own ecosystem and was a place that had been good to the Guinness family. Kildare, that is, more broadly. But while Arthur Guinness would leave Kildare, it would always remain a part of his life.
Well, the amazing thing was that the Arthur who came up to Dublin to found the brewery in St James's Gate, he kept on going back to Kildare, and he buried his children. Sadly, many of them died before him and his wife Olivia. And, so they were buried in Kildare, and he was passionate about supporting the Friendly Brothers, the Knot, St Patrick in Kildare, which was a tremendous charity to support good causes. It was an anti-duelling charity. So he was active in that. He was he became the main man. So he was always going back to Kildare, and he was ultimately buried with the rest of his family in Kildare.
The Dublin Arthur arrived in, we read, was still characterised by commercial and domestic buildings crammed cheek by jowl into narrow streets connected by alleys, lanes, and courts. And nowhere was that claustrophobic reality truer than in its liberties. There were 5 distinct liberties, what we now call the liberties, encompassed as parts of several. Brewing and distilling were the major industries of what we know as the Liberties. A brewery, formerly owned by Mark Rainsford, would open a new epoch for Guinness, acquired in 1759. I've always found it interesting that 1759 is the year we have in our minds as the start of Guinness. Really, it was the restart. And this brewery, as Ned points out, had significant challenges. It was not the handing over of a powerhouse, but a dilapidated brewery that needed a lot of work.
Well, it was arguably the city wall or the gate into the city or the tax point that was, and that is debatable, but that there is a kind of a myth around that. And obviously the pilgrimage to the Camino started off in Dublin from St James's, again with a body of water, of course, which obviously is synonymous with the brewery as well. So yeah, and the thing about it was, I think, the poverty. I felt that the original Arthur, I mean, he took on a disused brewery. It hadn't been running for 10 years. I mean, you can't run kit that hasn't been run for 10 years and just crank it up and so on. So he actually took on a dilapidated brewery. The poverty in the area was some of the worst in Western Europe, and but he had this vision, and I think he had this persistence to brew quality, persistent quality in the age before science as we know it. And that was a massive challenge. And he was a brewer. He stuck with brewing. He then obviously argued, or he debated his point to all the publicans who brewed their own left, right, and centre. The city was tiny, but every publican brewed their own. And he convinced them to take on Guinness and run their front of house and maybe run their accommodation or their stage coach facility or whatever they were doing as diversifications. So he was obviously good at what he did, and he was just focused. He was a real focused brewer, as the succession of generations that followed him were.
And challenges were plentiful. As we discussed on the podcast recently with Christina Wade, a great authority on the history of Irish beer, and her book just picked up an award, so well done, Christina, if you're listening. A great authority on what she calls the Porter Wars. It was a really difficult economic climate. Britain was making it harder and harder for Irish brewers, even in their own city. And the scales seemed very much balanced against a homegrown industry.
Well, absolutely, and he went before a committee on kind of looking at the tax that was, relativity of tax on Irish beer to English beer. Porter had come in from the UK, from Covent Garden, from London, and became established in the Irish palate. And a guy, Patrick Sweetenham, kind of brought on, and I think Patrick was the first Irishman to kind of pioneer a Dublin stout that was of good quality. So he established something before Arthur had found stout. I mean, Arthur had threatened to leave Dublin and move to Holyhead in Wales or Anglesey in Wales, and thank God he didn't. But the tariffs were so stiff against indigenous beer making that the challenge was on, and yeah, it was a very unfair system, if you like. The hops had to be bought from Kent, and the tariffs were unfairly placed on the local brewers in Dublin. So that was the context. Thank heavens he stuck with Dublin.
Politically, of course, the late 18th century was a time of very real turbulence. On a hyper-local level, the Liberties was in some ways the centre of the revolutionary conspiracy in Dublin, but on a national one and a global one. Famously, Arthur Guinness would be denounced in the Union Star, a Republican newspaper edited by Wattie Cox, as an active spy. Now, the considerable irony of that is that Cox himself was ultimately revealed to be an informer. And the Union Star, his paper, was printed on one side only because it was meant to be pasted up onto walls. It was that kind of publication. As his entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography notes, he responded to an offer of a reward for information leading to the arrest of the proprietor by presenting himself to the Undersecretary, negotiating a safe passage abroad, revealing himself as the culprit, and giving information on subversive activity. So he was not a reliable figure, to say the least. And the great historian of 18th century Dublin, David Dixon, says that actually, on the surface at least, the Guinness family passed unscathed through the political turbulence of late 18th century Ireland. Passing references to the public position taken by Mr. Guinness in politics, for example, he says supporting Catholic relief, opposing the Union, are ambiguous. And there were, Ned feels, there are often other concerns beyond politics for Guinness and his fledgling brewery.
And we were not revolutionaries, we were evolutionists, if you like. So, but that's pretty obvious that we might have that mindset, because quite quickly we became exporters of beer, and relatively within the first 100 years of Guinness, it was far more relevant what export markets we were either accessing or not accessing, which drove the state of the business. So we were working on the inside, and we were really, I think, driven, demented by certain things like the abolition of the Parliament in Dublin, which meant that a whole lot of people left the city. Key decision makers, decisions got made more distantly than they were. They had been. The city lost a lot of economic wealth and proximity to the decision making of the day, and so, but we were mercantilists. We were business folk. We were not kind of landed people with money. We were busy building our business from kind of a lowly origin to what became an international business.
The great danger, of course, is always reading history backwards. That's ever present in a story like this, because we know what Guinness became. And the Guinness family, as Ned puts it, they ultimately did become a part, and a significant part, of the establishment. But that's a 19th century story. That came later. With the successful roots laid down, a series of factors would move the family up in the world. And in a city as small as Dublin, some of those factors aren't too surprising.
We weren't kind of, you might say, part of the establishment. We became part of the establishment, and we married well. That was the other thing. The men married women with diaries and established businesses in Dublin that were sort of, far more established than us Guinnesses, and that was also part of the story. And that was also the role of the woman in my family. Some of the notable women who helped amazing good causes around the city centre, the city of the day. That also was really lovely to research and discover.
In the 19th century city, Guinness is a much more significant voice, and Arthur Guinness II is far more vocal in the political life of the capital. Like his father, he had supported increasing Catholic rights, and he said in 1797, the year before the United Irish Rebellion, the things most likely to produce this most desirable end, i.e. harmony amongst the Irish people, the total removal of the remaining barriers between us and our Roman Catholic brethren, and a constitutional reform in the representation of the people in Parliament. He would support Daniel O'Connell's movement in its infancy, but he came to disagree vocally with Daniel O'Connell on the question of repealing the Act of Union. In other words, bringing an Irish Parliament back to Dublin. Daniel O'Connell Jr., son of the Liberator, famously acquired a brewery himself, the Phoenix Brewery, on James's Street, producing what was called O'Connell Ale. And it should be noted that the O'Connells and the Guinnesses were at times political rivals, not just commercial rivals. In the 1841 repeal election, as it was known, Daniel O'Connell stood against and defeated Arthur Guinness Jr. That period would see Guinness referred to in some quarters as Protestant porter. But that sectarian dimension of it was all very much against the wishes of O'Connell himself.
So it was maybe a commercial rivalry that was quite a strong motivation, or could have been a strong motivation, and so I was really happy to find the public declaration that stated that absolutely there was no preference in terms of Guinness's preference to when it come to employing people or discriminating against humankind in any shape or form. And I think it must have frustrated my forebears quite strongly, because the label was easy to apply, but you needed people with knowledge to answer the label quite quickly for it not to permeate. And so that was a challenge, absolutely.
But if there is a name within the family that is better known now, it's Benjamin Lee Guinness, whose death in 1868 marks the beginning of the series House of Guinness. Grandson of the founder of the company, Benjamin's period at the helm was completely transformative for more than just the stout. I mean, if you were to ask me what are the big factors that transformed Guinness into a global brand, I think it was that they always had an awareness of what was happening beyond the walls of the brewery in terms of societal change. Benjamin was a major investor in Irish railway companies, which were opening up and making it easier, I suppose, to open up new markets across the island of Ireland. Benjamin's philanthropy included the very significant restoration of St. Patrick's Cathedral, which had fallen into very serious disrepair. You'll find his statue today outside the cathedral.
Well, he'd worked at the brewery for his life, and he continued to do so. He was an incredible man again, and I mean he took on the mantle, and I think at that time and the generations, that generation and the next ones, there was this issue of whether they went into politics or business, and obviously many of them went into religion. But there was this sort of pull me, push you thing that was going on. Oh, it was expected of someone who'd reached kind of at a certain level to go into public service.
Yeah.
And I think he answered the call. So he was again balancing a far bigger spectrum of what life had demanded of him, and he did it. He did it well. He did it well, Benjamin Lee.
Benjamin acquired 80 and 81 St. Stephen's Green, what is now known as Ivy House, home to the Department of Foreign Affairs. In the 1860s, the time when he did that, the decline of Dublin in the area between that magnificent home and the brewery was severe. Tenement blocks existed in the streets, even surrounding St. Stephen's Green, and the Liberties itself was in very severe decline. Visitors to the Liberties often could not believe the extreme poverty, and Ned feels it was quite inevitable that all of this would encourage more and more philanthropy.
Well, and if you think about the walk or the carriage ride in those days from Stevens's Green to the brewery, well, that was part of the worst part of Dublin in terms of the poverty that was of the day. So actually, taking that carriage or walking those streets, it was utterly obvious that there was a whole city around the brewery that was in need of love and care. And so whether it was Benjamin Lee fixing the roof of St. Patrick's or the landscaping scheme, St. Patrick's Park and the Beano, and the Bull Alley scheme that Edward Cecil brought in, it was a very obvious thing because, I mean, I think it must have been really trying for them. I mean, as they had become wealthy people, but they were always reinvesting to modernize, to expand, to push the business to the next level, and so on. So it must have been a very challenging thing for them to do, just to think about the surroundings. I'm so proud of them because they were busy thinking about things that governments hadn't got round to thinking about, the housing and the welfare of the people. They were decades before.
The cover of Ned's book shows two of Benjamin's children who have been completely recrafted in the public mind now. Arthur Edward Guinness, who would become Lord Ardyllin, and Edward Cecil Guinness, the first Earl of Ivy. The depictions of these men come from Vanity Fair, caricatures, I should say, and you were nobody in 19th century British society unless you appeared in a Leslie Ward Vanity Fair caricature. Oscar Wilde got that treatment, so did Charles Stewart Parnell and Edward Carson, the big names of British society. Over 4 decades, 1,325 portraits by Leslie Ward were published in Vanity Fair. And the fact that these two men made it there says everything. But the show does a fair bit of invention and speculation. I put it to Ned, what were these brothers actually like, does he feel? And what kind of tension, if any, was there?
I get the feeling that, Arthur, Ned's oldest brother, he actually was the first of us to go to school in England. And I don't think he liked it very much. He came out early and he, carried on elsewhere. But so he was sort of the one that things were expected of him. And if ever there was a sort of to do things that were expected, that primogenitor thing, the oldest son must do the traditional thing and go off and what have you. We'd made enough of kind of a noise and we'd established ourselves enough that I think Arthur was kind of expected to follow a pathway that wasn't kind of like grassroots and brewing and so on. So he took things on and he pushed along, and then the middle son, Benjamin, he wasn't that interested in business. I think he was a bon vivant. He enjoyed his life. He married well. He had a wonderful wife, I believe. And, he wasn't interested in the business. That was recognized. So it was Arthur and the youngest son, Ned, or Edward, who were gifted the brewery when Benjamin Lee had died. And, but I think there was that proximity that Ned had with his family. He wasn't pushed over to England. He was able to see things, and he was as astute as astute can be, with a great eye for detail.
Edward Cecil Guinness, first Earl of Ivy, would in time become the richest man in Ireland. What is his legacy beyond Guinness? Well, more than anything, I think the Ivy Trust, an extraordinary achievement for all kinds of reasons, built to house the working poor of Dublin. They were so ahead of their time. For example, when you contrast the Ivy Trust buildings with Dublin Corporation early housing schemes, and it was far too late in the day before the city got down to the nitty-gritty business of building working-class housing. Ivy had stood as a Conservative in the 1885 general election for Dublin, but he lost out to a Home Ruler. And I think he had the sense that the political winds were blowing in a different direction. But whatever about the politics of the day, the Ivy Trust and interventions like it in the city ensured Edward Cecil Guinness had a very important place in the life of this city and beyond.
I'm very proud the Ivy Trust is now the fastest growing social housing provider in the Leinster area. So some of my family, including myself, are involved with the trust. And, and obviously housing remains in crisis. And, so there's various tools to fix the issue. But again, it feels like we're always behind the curve. So maybe hopefully we'll one day we won't be.
When revolution did come, Guinness really could not avoid being swept up into it. Guinness, a company that had been in the sights of the trade union leader Jim Larkin, refused to become entangled in the 1913 lockout, but did sack boatmen for the company who refused to handle goods they regarded as tainted. Edward made a donation to the employers' fund, And the Irish Worker, which was the newspaper of Larkin, poured scorn on the brewery. Now, Larkin was very hostile to drink in the broadest sense. Publicans, the paper said, run this city, govern this city. Everything is made subservient to the interests of the drink seller. And I don't think he looked much higher on the drink producer. But for the most part, the company withstood the extreme turbulence of the 1913 lockout. In wartime, the company encouraged recruitment amongst their staff, offering a very generous half wage. And significantly, the people from the brewery who went off to fight in the First World War, they came from every level of the company, from right across the board. And even the family themselves had loved ones fighting in the conflict. When the Rising came to Dublin, the brewery fire brigade were dispatched to help save the city. But Guinness motorised delivery fleet vehicles would, at the Inchicore works of the Great Southern and Western Railway, be repurposed. And in a letter from General Maxwell, the man tasked with putting down the Easter Rising, dated 17th of May, 1916, he said, "At this moment, when the lorries you have so generously put at our disposal are being returned to you, I would like to take this opportunity of thanking you and your firm for the splendid spirit you have displayed in coming to our aid during an extremely critical period. A revolution on your doorstep is a pretty difficult thing to withstand entirely."
Well, of course, it was all around the brewery, it was all around the community. So utterly, one gets consumed by events one can't, hardly influence, let alone control. So that was the context, and the brewing did carry forward, and Guinness's as a business was remarkably unscathed by the strike, 1913. I mean, Dublin in all sorts of ways did close down, and it was by virtue of the package that was given to the employees and the families of the employees and the community that really Guinness was largely unscathed.
Ned Guinness is fascinated by his family's history, and he's also in his own way still at it. At Elvedon in England and Elvedon Hall, which was purchased originally by Edward Cecil Guinness, he continues to do his bit for the production of beer. But to the very end, as we'll hear, he is still a loyal company man. He won't touch a drop of any other stout.
We grow beautiful barley for Diageo, for in fact, it's probably the Scotch whisky department of Diageo, not the Guinness's side, but it could be. And please God, I know there's some wonderful Irish barley growers, growing barley particularly for Guinness, and long may that cherished link continue. So yeah, we're growing barley in Suffolk and Elvedon, and we do tillage in County Meath as well. So it's a beautiful thing. I love the crops. So my dad was an agrarian, and my great grandfather Rupert was as well. So we've always loved agriculture, and obviously Guinness has only 4 ingredients, and to be able to be supplying one of them, and I was able to have a wonderful. There's a brewer called Brendan Moore in my village in Suffolk, and he brews Elvedon ale and stout. I like the ale. I don't tend to touch stout that isn't Guinness, frankly, because that would be wrong. And I do think the number of generations of Dubliners, of Guinness family, of non-Dubliners, from all besides, but the amount of TLC, tender love and care that's gone into Guinness as the stout, I think it's just beautiful, a beautiful product, and I would drink no other stout, frankly.
Hope you enjoyed that edition of the Three Castles Burning podcast. If you did, please be sure to leave it a review. Special thank you, as ever, to the patrons of the podcast. I'll be back very, very soon. I'm conscious that it was a bit of a break there with my teeth problems and other things, but I'm back speaking into microphones and on the radio and beyond. So thank you all, as ever, for tuning in. See you soon.